Hi friends, and welcome back. I'm super excited to share this project with you and had so much fun making it, as I'm actually expecting my first child, and he's gonna be a little baby boy, which we are so excited to welcome into our family. But it's also just put me in such a creative mood to create some little homemade pieces for him. And this is just one of those like trendy embroidery sweaters that I'd seen floating around online and decided to make one for my boy. So here I tested out a couple different Canva fonts in some different orders, and once I picked the one that I liked, I went ahead and printed it. So I chose to print on the Sulky Solvy stick and stitch paper. I could have also used like a water soluble fabric marker, but I feel like this is way easier and like my perfectionistic brain prefers this method, so I printed it with my printer. There is a way to make it print in the draft setting so that it's a lighter color, but for some reason I can never figure it out, so I just ended up changing the transparency in the Canva web browser to like 50% so it didn't print full black, because if it would have printed full black, it probably would have bled that ink onto my white yarn that I'm gonna use. And here I just kind of used like the little rivets in this sweater to find the center of it and line it up that way, and then I just used a ruler to kind of eyeball and make sure everything looked nice and even. And once I had it set in place, I went ahead and peeled it. No, I didn't officially stick it on because I wanted to test out the placement of it and make sure, once again, double check, cover my bases, make sure it was sitting straight. So I just made sure it was realigned. If it wasn't quite there yet, I just peeled it off and put it back on. When I was happy with the placement of it, I did make sure like I super pushed that sticky paper into my sweater just to make sure that it stuck, because I didn't want it peeling off or falling off during the stitching phase of this project. Now, to get going on the stitching portion of this project, I did pick up a darning needle from Michael's craft store, and then I also got this yarn that's nice and chunky and also just a pretty white color. And then I did begin this project by making the quilter's knot. It's just kind of a fun little trick to create a knot at the end of your tail so that your project doesn't kind of slip through the cracks, or rather slip through the threads of the knitted sweater. So this is just a little trick to create a knot on the end. If you want a full tutorial on that, you can find that tutorial in the link above, but this is just how I got started with my project, and I did make sure to leave a long enough tail so that I could kind of weave that end into the project at a later time. When stitching on clothing, it always does feel a little bit more tedious or a little bit more awkward because you have to go up and inside through the piece of clothing, so it definitely takes some getting used to. I honestly haven't really stitched much on clothing, so this proved to be a fun new project for me. So here I just went ahead and pulled my thread, or rather my yarn, not really working with DMC thread here. I pulled it all the way through, and there you can see that my knot caught, and then that's my tail that I'm going to tuck in at a later time. Before officially starting this project, I will say that I've never embroidered a name on a sweater like this, so I did go ahead and do a little test run on a knit sweater that I already have that I'm planning on donating to Value Village that I just don't care about, and I stitched a little bit on that one just to get a feel for it, to give myself a bit of practice, as I was nervous to make this like the very first stitch that I've ever made with a chunky yarn, but it turned out just fine on my other sweater, and I only did like 5 little stitches, so really I had no experience, but I just wanted to get a feel for it. And so here you'll even see, like, I think it just takes time if this is your first time doing it, just getting a feel for what feels right to you or what feels most comfortable, because it is awkward stitching on a piece of clothing, and it is also just kind of of awkward stitching with such a thick piece of yarn. It just feels different than like your traditional hand embroidery. So I think initially you just have to kind of play with it until you find what's most comfortable for you. So here you can definitely see I was a little bit struggling, but over time I got into a rhythm and I got into just a movement that worked for me and that felt right in my hands. So you might have to play around with it a bit until you find something that feels right to you. I should also totally mention the stitch I'm using here is called the chain stitch. It's a very simple stitch. If you want a full tutorial on that, I'll link my tutorial above and you can check that out. But if you've seen these like trendy or viral cute little knit name sweaters, that is the stitch that they typically are using. You can achieve this with your hand embroidery darning needle, but if you're not really into hand embroidery, you can also do it with a crochet hook. That's an option as well. I have never tried that method before, but it's definitely an option out there. At this point, it felt like a little moment of truth for me as I hit basically the halfway completion point of my first letter, and as you can tell here, it was a little bit smushed, so it was a little bit like feeling a bit nervous because my letter is looking pretty tight. And I will say for this project, I did use a baby sweater that was designed for a 6-month-old, and also I chose a name that was a bit longer. I thought that this thread would be like a nice chunky size for it, but I honestly feel like I could have gone with a step down in thickness of size just because I was working with a bit of a longer name. So that's one thing that I probably would have changed, and I just haven't learned how to gauge yet as this was my first project. But if this was like a 3 or 4 letter name, I think this yarn would be no problem. Just for a bit of a longer name, I would tone back the thickness of my yarn. Whenever I reached the end of my yarn, I simply treated it like a hand embroidery hoop as to how I would finish a project, and I simply kind of wove my thread or my yarn under a couple of the stitches that I had already made, and then I simply just double knotted it. And if my thread or my string was still longer after double knotting it, I simply snipped that off with scissors, and that's just how I tied it off. And it doesn't seem to be like too bulgy or like scratchy on the back, so I think it ended up working just fine. At this point, I had hit the halfway point in finishing this bottom portion of the name, or rather the full name there, and my plan with that was to create the name Anthony with a little bit of a thicker thread, and then write the little part in stitching with a smaller amount of thread, just to kind of give more detail and more pop to this piece. Now, I felt like I had this genius idea to split my yarn in half to be able to use the same yarn, but just to kind of make the weight of it or the thickness of it smaller. So I went ahead and split the yarn, and then I thread it on my needle and attempted to get started with the little portion of this name. I will say that I learned fairly quickly that yarn is really not like DMC embroidery floss, where with DMC embroidery floss you can simply split the threads and use however many threads you want to use. With yarn, I learned that whenever you untwist it, you're basically untwisting like the strength and the sustenance that holds it together. So basically whenever I started stitching with this, it got like super fluffy and it lost its twistiness and just the ability to be strong and hold together, and it just kept expanding and expanding. But in my head I was like, just keep going, we're gonna try and make this work. I already started, too late now, so just keep trucking. but it basically didn't work, and it eventually actually just totally like ripped in half. So I ended up having to take this out and try again with a different idea. As much as I really wanted to finish this project, and I'm usually super excited to finish it and kind of rush through a project just because of that excitement, I did take my time when removing this yarn, as I was super nervous of accidentally cutting the sweater itself. So I just took my time and was able to get it out. I was also nervous that because my darning needle was so big that I might have damaged the sweater or left like these big gaping holes, but it actually ended up being just fine. So here we are again with a blank slate for the little portion of this title. For my second attempt at these little letters, I decided to just use some DMC embroidery floss and that matched my yarn color to the best of my ability, because clearly the yarn thread is too thick for these tiny letters. Separating the yarn didn't work, so I resorted to my comfort zone of using DMC embroidery floss. Now, I honestly wasn't sure how using DMC embroidery thread would work on this sweater, just because I've never used this type of tiny thread on such a thick knit sweater, but it ended up being just fine, and I think it turned out honestly pretty cute. I will say it did feel pretty weird though, switching from such a chunky yarn and a giant darning needle to a tiny embroidery needle with some DMC thread. So it took a little bit of getting used to kind of figure out what I was doing again, but once again it worked out no problem, and I'm honestly very pleased with how it turned out. And here's my project with all the stitching complete. I think it turned out so cute, and I'm excited to see it officially finished. All that's left to do is remove that stabilizer. To do that, I'm just running my project under some warm water in my kitchen sink here, and that makes this sulky stitch and solve dissolve. It does kind of like leave a little bit of a sticky residue, and if everything doesn't come out on the initial first try, you can go back over again and again with water, and if still there's a little bit left over, there's really no need to worry about it because this is an article of clothing, so it's going to be washed, and whenever you wash it, it'll get rid of the rest of that residue. But here you can see like I did my best to kind of maneuver my finger close to those stitches, because that's where the stabilizer likes to kind of stick around or hang out, and so I just did my best to remove that, and once I had gotten the majority of it, I called that good. And here's my completed project in its soaking wet form. So all that I did here was just kind of rinse out or squeeze out the remaining heavy water, and then I set it out to dry. Now honestly, I probably should have washed this sweater before starting the project, but I was just too excited. Next time I'll do it differently, but that's where I was at with the project. And here is my officially finished sweater. I honestly think it turned out so good, especially because this was my first attempt. It was honestly my first time ever working with embroidering with yarn, and then it was also my first time embroidering on a knit sweater. So it proved to be a new and fun, exciting challenge. Now I will say the perfectionist inside of me does see the few mistakes that I made. As you can see, there's a little bit of disconnect kind of between my A. It doesn't look like it's totally combined. My O is also a bit smushed, so I definitely wish I would have used a little bit of a lesser chunky yarn. Again, I think this yarn would have worked perfect if the name was shorter. I was just working with a longer name. And then also you can kind of see like the stitches or like the rivets of this knit sweater. Some of them got pulled, and that means that I pulled my stitches too tight in those places. So next time if I were to stitch another sweater, I would definitely try to relax a bit more on the tightness that I was pulling it. But other than that, I'm honestly so pleased with it. And then here's how my back turned out. It did get a little bit sloppy in some places just because it got a little bit tangled, so next time I would try to be a bit neater with it, but it's not scratchy or anything, so I'm really pleased with the feeling of it, even though like I didn't use any sort of stabilizer in the back. But overall, I'm really pleased with it. I hope you enjoyed this little stitch along with me, and I hope you attempt your own, and this encourages and inspires you to make your own, as this was my very first attempt and I feel like I had success. So thanks for joining me, and happy stitching, my friend.